You did. Or not the one who said. Yeah.
Drop your popcorn.
Yeah, I got it. Here, we're live again.
All right, and you should be ready to go.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone who's tuning in. Thanks for your time and attention. So my name is Julia Dohner. I'm a fourth-year PhD candidate at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and I'm going to talk about science. And for me, what that means is basically how I try to understand the natural world around us. So I kind of take issue with the label scientist because I kind of think that everyone's a scientist as long as you are curious about what's going on around you and kind of use whatever tools you have to try and answer those questions. I guess in our society, when someone becomes a scientist once they start being paid to do it. So by that definition, I suppose I am a scientist, or I guess more accurately, I'm a professional scientist. But anyways, so I just really wanted to emphasize that, like, what science really is just being curious about something that you see or experience in the world around you and kind of using tools and taking measurements or observations to try and answer the question that you might have had. So I am a PhD student, and I am in this program called the Marine Chemistry and Geochemistry program. So I study marine chemistry, and I'm in my fourth year out of probably 5 or 6 towards getting my PhD. And I have a PhD advisor. His name is Dr. Ralph Keeling, and he is actually the son of Charles David Keeling, who was responsible for creating the Keeling curve, which some of you might recognize. They're continuous measurements of atmospheric CO2 levels starting in 1958. And this curve is kind of the poster child for the fight against fossil fuel emissions and against climate change, because we can see very clearly that CO2 levels in the atmosphere have been steadily rising. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my life or I guess the details of my program and of being a PhD student at Scripps. So when I keep mentioning Scripps, what I'm referring to is Scripps Institution of Oceanography. So it's an ocean and earth science research center in La Jolla, California. So that's in San Diego County. And Scripps is actually connected to UC San Diego. So it's the Ocean and Earth Science School of UC San Diego. But in fact, Scripps predates UCSD and was kind of used as part of the justification for creating a UC campus in this area. But Scripps was founded in 1903, making it one of the oldest earth science centers in the world. It offers undergraduate majors and graduate programs and covers a huge breadth of research topics. So some include, some people here study waves and circulation in the ocean. Some people study marine life, ice and climate. There's biodiversity and conservation. There's a biodiversity and conservation center. And then there's also one of my closest friends in my cohort studies natural products for pharmaceuticals. So that's looking for compounds that are produced by organisms in nature and seeing if those molecules or compounds have kind of uses for making medicines. So at Scripps, it's quite large. There's about 1,500 people between the faculty, students, and staff. And down here at the bottom is a picture of the Scripps Pier. And off to the left, you can see the La Jolla Cove. And my office is actually located right at the base of the Scripps Pier. So as a PhD student at Scripps, the majority of the time of my 5 to 7 years completing my PhD is spent doing research. And so I study carbon. And when I tell people about my research, I kind of just break it into 3. I have 3 projects, and describe them kind of based off of where those projects happen. So for my first project, all of that research actually happens in my office at my computer. So there's a picture of me on the left sitting at my computer where I use a computer model to model the global carbon cycle. So I'll actually talk a little bit more in depth about each of these topics, but this is just giving you an overview. So the first project is a modeling project. My second project that kind of makes up my dissertation research happens in the lab, where I'm basically connecting tubes. You can see me wrestling with a wrench here to develop a system to remove all of the CO2 gas from seawater samples, and that CO2 gas eventually gets sent into an instrument that measures carbon isotopes. And my third project happens in the field. So the field for me is in Okinawa, Japan, where there's a coral reef that I and my peers study. So in Okinawa, I make measurements and collect seawater samples on this coral reef to track the influence of corals and seagrasses on seawater chemistry. So I'll go a little bit more into depth on each of these. So the first project on my computer, I mentioned that it was a modeling project. So basically, we don't have a great grasp on the processes that influence how much carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere. I mean, we understand it to a fundamental level. If we release more CO2 from burning fossil fuels, atmospheric CO2 goes up. But fossil fuels aren't the only thing that influence how much carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere. So the ocean can actually take up some CO2, and the land so that the carbon dioxide dissolves into the ocean. So that's how it takes up carbon. And the land, with plants and trees, they photosynthesize, and they also remove some of this carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And so we see kind of past wiggles in the atmospheric CO2 record. And so I'm trying to model different processes to see if I can replicate those past wiggles. And I love this graphic. So basically it shows the relative sizes of how much carbon goes into these different reservoirs. So I mentioned earlier that the ocean absorbs carbon dioxide and the land also absorbs carbon dioxide. So everything on the top half of the plot is carbon dioxide that's released into the atmosphere. So the gray is fossil fuels and the beige is from land use change. So that's kind of like, converting grasslands into pastures for agricultural purposes. And so that releases carbon dioxide. And everything on the bottom half is where that carbon dioxide goes. So a lot of it goes into the atmosphere. That's the blue, or the bright blue. But some of it's absorbed into the ocean. That's the dark green. And some of it is taken up by the land. And that's the light green. But there's actually, there's some amount of carbon that we just can't figure out where it ends up going. And so that's what this pink line across the bottom is. So ultimately, I'm hoping that through my project, I can reduce the magnitude of the amount of carbon that we don't know where it ends up. So I know that was a lot at once. I provide my email address. Well, we have 10 minutes for questions at the end. And also if you can't get your question in, or if you'd rather just email it, I provide my email address at the end. So I love talking about research and I welcome lots of questions. So continuing on, my second out of 3 research projects happens in the lab. So this I mentioned, I said I'm connecting tubes. And so you can see the system I've built in the bottom right. It just looks like a mess of kind of stainless steel tubing connected to various flow meters and such. And eventually it ends up into the instrument on the right with the computer screen. So the idea is to extract all of the carbon dioxide gas that's dissolved into seawater and then send that gas into an analyzer. So the schematic on the left is of kind of the part of the system that does that gas extraction. So in the innermost tube, I run the seawater sample in one direction, and then that's housed in a bigger tube where CO2-free gas is running in the opposite direction. And the thing that separates the water and the airflow is a CO2 permeable membrane. So it's actually Teflon tubing, and the Teflon is really easy for carbon dioxide gas to dissolve or to permeate across. And so I'm hoping that by running these two streams in opposition, all of the carbon dioxide gas will dissolve into the carrier gas and then get taken up and out away into the analyzer through the top left. And so kind of a more detailed diagram of what's going on with the tubes looks like this, where I actually have pumps that are pumping the seawater and some acid to help convert all carbon containing molecules in the seawater into carbon dioxide gas. So the combination of sample and acid goes into the first contactor, which is what the thing is on the left. And then the gas, the carrier gas gets sent through with, and ideally picks up all of the carbon dioxide off of the sample, and that gets sent to an analyzer. And then I have a second contactor just to make sure that all of the carbon dioxide in the seawater is actually getting removed. So if we see anything coming off of the second contactor, then it means that the first contactor isn't quite doing its job. So the third one, and the most visually pleasing, so the third project is the one that happens in the field. So I, in October of last year, traveled to Okinawa, Japan with some of my peers, and each of us studied something different on this coral reef. So our study site is in the bottom right, and so you can see the land on the bottom right, and everything that's bright blue is actually the reef. It's quite shallow, and then everything that's dark blue is where it gets really, really deep. And all of the yellow pins are locations where I collected a sample of seawater. And so we call this a spatial survey. So, one morning we go out on this boat, you can see in the top right, and as quickly as we can collect a sample from each of those spots. And then another morning we go back and do the whole thing again. So we can see kind of how the chemistry of the seawater changes across this area of the reef and also changes from day to day. So what I'm trying to figure out is, on the coral reef, there's areas that are dominated by coral and are dominated by seagrasses. And so I'm trying to figure out if the areas dominated by coral, if the chemistry of that seawater looks different than the chemistry of the seawater in areas dominated by seagrass. And eventually I'm hoping to use the measurements of the seawater chemistry to say something about what's going on with the organisms underneath. And on the left here is one of the advisors and one of my peers mooring an instrument on the reef that measures the current. And so the person on the right was measuring kind of the physics of this coral reef. So that's really helpful for understanding kind of the water flow and how that influences the chemistry. So why carbon? So I realize I'm running out of time, so I'll try and move through this quickly. But the point I wanted to hit home was that there's a number of factors that influence kind of why people end up studying what they do study. So I definitely can't say that I knew exactly what I wanted to study when in graduate school, when I was in high school or college. I had no idea that I'd be studying, carbon in those three ways. But the path or the kind of decisions that led me here, I've listed here. So the first and most important one was in graduate school, you have to choose an advisor who will oversee your research. And a lot of people choose their advisor based off of research, matches in their research interests. And that did play a role, but really I chose my advisor based off of someone I thought I could get along well with, because I knew I'd be working with this person for 5 to 7 years. So I wanted someone who who I got along well with, who I liked the way they approached research questions, and also who I felt like respected me and my way of thinking. So that's how I picked my advisor, and that's been a fantastic decision. Working with my advisor has been one of my favorite parts of graduate school. Second, I knew I also wanted to study something kind of large scale. I wanted to think about research questions that involved different systems. So for example, like the land interacting with the atmosphere, interacting with the ocean, rather than just thinking about like an individual species and, one pathway within that species that leads to them being bigger or smaller. And finally, I wanted to do research that was interdisciplinary. So I wanted to do research that was relevant to a lot of different people for different reasons, because I really enjoy talking to a lot of different people. And I thought it'd be really fun to do research that kind of allowed me to interact and work with a lot of different scientists doing different kinds of work. And finally, I think fate played a role. Ultimately there are some things that you just can't control. And so by chance, if I didn't come to Scripps, I wouldn't have been working with this advisor. So there's a lot of chance that played a role, but ultimately I'm very happy with my research. So I'll go through how I got here. So I ended up doing this PhD program, studying carbon. So I really didn't know what I wanted to do after college, basically for a long time. I did go on this really formative field trip in middle school where we visited the Chesapeake Bay, and I just was so struck by the intricate ecosystem of the Chesapeake Bay, how the atmosphere was interacting with the water, and that was affecting the organisms that lived inside or underneath the water. And I kind of kept that in the back of my mind. And in high school, I ended up taking an AP chemistry class, and that was after, I tried to get into all these other classes, but they were all full. So I had no choice, or I ended up having to take chemistry. And I actually really loved my teacher and I loved my peers, and that was a really, really fun class. And I discovered how much I liked chemistry and ended up majoring in chemistry in college. And it was at Pomona College, that's where I went to undergrad, that I learned about oceanography. And that was from one of my professors who had just completed her PhD at Scripps. So when I was in college, I applied to the Scripps PhD program. And after graduating, in the fall after I graduated, I entered the PhD program. And now, almost 4 full years later, I'm still here cranking away. And hopefully I have about 2 more years left to complete the degree. So with that, so here's a picture of me and one of my peers on the right, collecting samples for my research in Okinawa. I wanted to thank you for your time and attention and open the floor to any questions that you might have. And so I know there's a Q&A feature here. And then also, if you would rather say your question, feel free to just unmute it and unmute your microphone, and I'll be happy to take any of them over audio as well. And I'm happy to answer questions, anything as broad as you'd like about the state of the environment or climate science, and I'm also happy to answer questions about my research or my path. Okay, so I have a question here from Madison. Thanks so much for your question. So it reads, what made you decide that you wanted to major in chemistry? So this is taking me back to kind of beginning first half of college. I actually took a lot of classes in a lot of different areas. I wanted to give myself the chance to see if there's something else that I liked. So I took philosophy classes, economics, art history, art psychology. But I think ultimately, I really, really liked the chemistry classes. And I also took chemistry in college. And I really liked the chemistry classes that were offered. And I really, really liked the faculty. And so, it wasn't like clear cut, okay, this is what I'm going to do, and chemistry is what I need to major in to accomplish it. It was kind of like how I felt about the classes, how I felt about the people. And so I think I just connected with the faculty really well and enjoyed the work for the chemistry classes. And so that's what ultimately influenced it, my decision to become a chemistry major. And everything kind of ended up falling into place. So I think people will tell you that a lot. So I don't have any, profound answer to that, but it was just kind of circumstantial. So I have another question from Melinda. Melinda asked, how does eutrophication impact the ocean's ability to be a carbon sink? So eutrophication is a big problem on small scale ecosystems, but actually the things that, so if you think about the Chesapeake Bay or your local river or creek or stream or lake, eutrophication can wreak havoc on the ecosystem on that scale, but the ocean carbon sink is operating on a much, much bigger scale. So think about, comparing the Chesapeake Bay to the Pacific Ocean. So the ocean carbon sink is actually dictated by ocean temperature and winds. And so as the ocean warms up, it's actually going to be able to take up less carbon. So that's something that a lot of people have been studying. So I would say that eutrophication doesn't really impact the ocean's ability kind of on the greater scale to be a carbon sink, but that doesn't mean that eutrophication is not important. It definitely is important, but just on different scales. A question from Rayanne. Madison, I'll come back to your other question. So the question from Rayanne is, how does your knowledge of the sciences affect your everyday life? And I love that question. I think, so a lot of my friends are my peers from my PhD program. So a lot of my friends study also earth sciences. And we're constantly kind of looking at the clouds or at the ripples in the ocean around us, asking, I wonder why it looks like that today, or I wonder why the clouds are doing this. And we'll kind of go and try and find a friend who studies clouds or studies kind of ocean circulation or ocean waves. And so I think my daily life is definitely way more enriched in that respect, because my eyes are open to all these things that are happening. And I realize that these are questions that we can answer. And so I think that's a really lovely way that it's that my research and being in this science PhD program has influenced my everyday life. So Madison asked, where are you headed next in your research and studies? So right now I have 2 more years to wrap up my research. So basically I'm just going to be working on those 3 projects I talked about. And after that, I don't have a plan. A lot of people start PhD programs and then want to become professors after. And teaching is definitely appealing to me, but I'm also considering other options, including doing environmental consulting. So for example, helping a company or the government try and figure out what the environmental impacts of a decision are and how to be more environmentally friendly or reduce those impacts. And so, yeah, I guess right now I'm just kind of focused on finishing up those 3 projects. That'll probably take another 2 years. And then after that, I'll figure out what comes next. There aren't any more questions, or I don't see any more questions. So please type away if you have them. But I guess it's a good chance for me to talk about what's happening in the immediate near future, which is that I'm going back to Japan at the end of March for another 4 months, which is an example of something that's really awesome about earth science research, is that, it can take you to places all over the world. And I was really interested in doing work in Japan because I actually lived in Tokyo when I was a kid, and I speak Japanese, and I wanted to find a way to connect my research to Japan and maybe go back there. And we actually have collaborators in Okinawa, so it ended up being this perfect connection, and that's what allowed me to go there in the fall. And so I'm going back for 4 months starting at the end of March this year in order to continue that research. And that I'm doing that through a fellowship that I applied for. So I didn't really talk about funding here, but basically, you apply as a PhD student, you apply to get money to do your research. And then if you are awarded that money, then you kind of get to go off and do what you said you wanted to do. So it's a great opportunity for you to think about the research that you want to do and the places you want to go and the people you want to work with, and then try and get someone to support you financially to go do that. So this spring, I'm receiving money from 2 different programs that offered a joint fellowship. And so I'll be funded to go continue my research in Japan and kind of build collaborations with researchers in Okinawa. Okay, I have another question. So again, from Madison, thank you. It says, I'm looking to go into an environmental field. What kind of steps can I take to decide what I want to study and what kinds of research I can pursue? That's a great question. And I think it's really, really important if you think you want to go into an environmental field, or if you want to do research in an environmental field, to find opportunities to work in labs in whatever capacity that might mean. I think it's really important for people to kind of advocate for themselves so that they are compensated for their time. So I'm not going to recommend volunteering in a lab because I think that everyone's busy and everyone's time is valuable. So if you have the chance to find a paid position or get college or high school credit for working in a lab, that is the best thing you can do because, you know, and you don't need to necessarily find like the perfect lab that you think you're exactly interested in to work in. It's more important just to find a lab setting, try it out, and then from there you'll realize, oh, this is actually what I love. This is a component of lab work that I love, or, ooh, I really, really don't like, you know, I don't like pipetting. And so you can gather that information as you move forward. So I think finding opportunities to work in various labs or in one lab for a long time is really valuable, both for bumping up your lab research experience, but then also for giving you an idea of what you do and don't like in a lab setting and what kind of research questions you're interested in. If there aren't any more questions, I think I might wrap things. Oh, thank you. Thank you for your thank yous. Wrap things up there. But again, if you think of something else that you wish you had asked, or just if you think of another question, please email me. I love answering questions about science and about my research. And again, thank you so much for your time and attention. I really enjoyed this presentation and answering your questions. So thank you.